imperialism and violence and domination becomes a love story that involves consent. A little bit like what I suggested was happening in Paso de Dos in my last presentation. So the feminine, in 1886, Ignacio Ramirez, a Mexican thinker, intellectual, compared Malinche to Eve, saying, "It is one of the mysteries of fate that all nations owe their fall to the ignominy of a woman." The feminine functioned as the hinge in the nation-building discourse of the 19th century. The condemnation of Malinche allowed for the subjugation of the gendered other, the woman, in order to rhetorically recuperate the racial other. Because it was important for the Mexicans and for other countries, even Argentina that had a very small indigenous population, to recuperate the indígena in the national imaginary. So both indígenas and mestizos had to be embraced symbolically, if not in fact, to forge a cohesive, unique sense of national identity. The price of this highly ambivalent identity, however, meant that racism was lived as misogyny. And I think that's the most important thing about the 19th century in the Americas in the issues of race and gender. That we couldn't admit to racism, so we had to live it as misogyny. We had to blame the woman for the downfall. Octavio Paz, for example, puts it in The Sons of the Malinche. He says, violence against women, the indigenous women, is justified. This is in 1950, right? Our Nobel Prize winner says, violence against women is justified because she is always and inevitably the Malinche, our mother. And because of her, Mexicans, so she's la chingada, no, the fucked one, and because of her, Mexicans are always the fruit of violation. So that this kind of misogyny is never seen as that, as what it is. So the Mexican is defined in opposition to the feminine other, never as including the feminine within the imaginary. So mestizaje was the cornerstone for the nation state, but it sustained an ambivalent and always negotiated sense of national identity. Mestizaje, as the affirmation of the mestizo, involved an equivocal attempt at valorizing a mixed national identity. And the space that this creates, the space of mestizaje, discursively creates from the very beginning, from the 16th century, a term that's called nepantla, which is very important for understanding mestizaje, which means both and. It's neither the indigenous anymore, and it's not yet, or never will be, the Spanish, but it's this negotiated in-between, which is very different from the other paradigms I'm going to show you. I think that the dump, the garbage dump, in Carballido's play captures the geography of Nepantla. It's a geography of disaster and revalorization. This space has been dumped on, right, literally, devalued, and transforms the things that are closest to us into garbage, right? Everything that we use gets converted into garbage. But it is also a space of constant reconfiguration. Things grow in the dump, the children say. You find things there. You can make new use of them. So there's always a space of glorious possibility and an aesthetics that comes out of mestizaje. The aesthetics is one associated with what Robert Stam, who's a great Brazilianist, I don't know if you know his work on Brazilian cinema, has called the strategic redemption of the low. So it's a strategic thing to reincorporate, to revalorize, to recycle, to reaffirm that which has been devalued. Mestizaje, as sight, as recuperative practice, ushers us into the spectacle of the lost and found in terms of epistemology, race, and cultural theory. How to read the codes, the signs, the discarded concepts found in the dump. Carballido depicts a population faced with a never-ending drama of the indecipherable, never knowing how to cumplir esa manda milagrosamente pedida. They continue to act knowing that they don't know the answer, fully aware that every attempt to make something of the crash is another historia, another attempt at interpretation. And then I'm just going to very briefly jump over this next part, but I think it's interesting, if anybody's really interested in mestizaje, that it has a history, which is the biological mixing, but it's also a social project. In the 20th century, in Mexico, but in other countries in the Americas, it was used to combat the eugenics movement, the movement to whiten the Americas by having, just the whiter parts of the population reproduce. And José Vasconcelos, in his very famous treatise, La Raza Cósmica, from 1925, talks about the mestizo as the model for the cosmic race, which is the final universal race, which is the race that through fusion, through mixing, comes to transcend race altogether. Now, I don't know what other people think about this. I think this is also a product, of course, of a very racist ideology. On one hand, you want to eliminate race through eugenics, on one hand, breed it out, and on the other hand, you want to transcend it to the point that race is no longer a category, because we're above it. So I think it's both sides of the same coin that's happening in the 20th century. And it, of course, has to do with all of this anxiety around disappearance, the disappearance of race, the disappearance of the white race. The recuperative project of mestizaje in the early 20th century has continued in different ways to shape its usage today. Behind the current term, the older one remains, transvalued, but there. While mestizaje has been closely linked to projects of the nation state, it's also been used in other parts of, it's also used in other parts of the world. It's not limited to that. The body of the intermediaria, or la Malinche, allows the new to come into the world, be it a new race, or in Carballido's play, the face of modernity. The newness extends to new theories of cultural identity among groups. The Chicanas, I don't know if you know anything about the Latino stuff in the United States, it's very, very interesting. But the Chicanas, which are the Mexican Americans, draw on the idea of Malinche, and Vasconcelos is La Raza. Their thing is La Raza, the Chicanos define themselves as La Raza. And from their theories of mestizaje to define their own feelings of straddling cultures, being on both sides. It's always the choque, the coming together of the two that are harnessed in mestizaje. So mestizaje both reveals the mark of its initiating conditions and transcends them. It has a history, it tells a history, and it gets re-theorized at different historical moments as part of various social projects. For all its different deployments, cultural, aesthetic, political, the history of its initiating conditions, that is, colonial violence, dominance, rape, and desire, never quite free themselves of the gendered and racialized bodies that live it. So that's mestizaje. Hybridity, I think, comes from a different colonial model. It has a similar etymology, which is, again, the mixing, but it's more botanical, scientific, even engineered. Generally, it refers to the mixing of species rather than races. None but the most racist theorists speak of hybrid people or human species. We refer to hybrid plants or to hybrid cultures, but not to people. So while mestizaje tells a history